Hello. If I could have everyone's attention. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Jason Hollander, editor of NYU Magazine, and on behalf of the Taub Center for Israel Studies, the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life, I want to thank everyone for coming to this prestigious event with these very prestigious panelists, and for braving the cold weather, and for placing your interest in these important topics for today. We'd like to invite you to stay for a reception right after the program ends, right here in the Rosenthal Pavilion. You may have noticed that Jeffrey Goldberg, one of our panelists, his book, which is titled Prisoners, a Muslim and Jew Across the Middle East Divide, is on sale outside this room. And I think if you ask nicely, Mr. Goldberg would be happy to sign a copy if you purchase it. And
Ask nicely.
yeah, you don't even have to ask nicely. Just put it in his hands. And of course, they make fantastic holiday gifts, so keep that in mind. Also, please feel free to take a copy of the fall 2007 issue of the NYU Alumni Magazine, which is right on the table outside, and the one with the big green elephant on the cover. And of course, this also makes an excellent holiday gift. Lastly, this event is being recorded for webcasts on the NYU website, and if you just tune into the website soon, there should be some information posted if you want to watch some of today's events. So now it's my real pleasure to introduce Mr. Fred Lafer, who's the president of the Taub Foundation. NYU's own Taub Center for Israel Studies was established with a very generous gift by the foundation, and Mr. Lafer is also part of the NYU family, having received 2 degrees from NYU, one from the university's former School of Engineering, and the other from the School of Law. Mr. Lafer is also the chairman of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which counts among its members Dennis Ross, the former chief US negotiator in the Middle East. In addition to numerous other affiliations, Mr. Lafer has served as a member of the executive committee for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I'd like you all to please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Fred Lafer.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome to what I think is a 6-month double anniversary recognition of the State of Israel. Just on November 29th, 1947, just 60 years ago, the United Nations, by a vote of 33-12, created effectively the State of Israel alongside of a Palestinian state. The real implementation was not to take place for 6 months, and so it did in 1948. So we're lucky, because now we have 6 months to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel. Regarding the Taub Foundation, several years ago, with the strong encouragement of the university administration, the Taub Foundation undertook the honor and the obligation to create a center for Israel studies. And that's happened. Many of you know the center. Many of you may even be students within the center. But in the short time, in its 3rd year of active activity on the campus, we now have offered this year 14 courses, hundreds of students in the doctoral programs, postdocs, visiting fellows, all under the direction of our professor, who you'll hear from in a little while, Professor Ron Zweig, who is the leader and the person who made much of this possible as our chairperson. And I also have the privilege of introducing the moderator tonight, Ray Suarez, who is probably known to almost everybody here. You may have seen him as the active and leading correspondent on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. And he advised me, and this is hot news, right? That you've just returned from Israel and have done a 2-hour documentary on the history of Jerusalem, which will be there's no preview available yet because she just got back. Right. But within the next several months, you'll get to see it on PBS. Good. And he is the holder of many numerous coveted awards. I read the list. and I was in awe of seeing the honors and the awards that you've gotten, and certainly deserve it. I can only tell you that when I mentioned to a close associate of mine about the program today, and I mentioned your name, this is a fellow whose opinion I value, he said to me, he's a serious correspondent and worth listening to. I don't think I need say more, so I give you your moderator, a serious correspondent worth listening to.
Thank
Ray
you very much.
is here. Thank you.
Well, if you make a lot of your living talking, somebody saying you're worth listening to is, you know, you can take that to the bank. It's nice to be in this particular space. For those of you who were students at New York University at some time in the recent decades, you may remember this as the site of the Loeb Student Center. I spent too much of my college career on the 9th floor of that building because that was where both the Washington Square News and WNYU were located, on opposite ends of the 9th floor with one co-ed bathroom in between. And I should have spent more time in class and less time at both the radio station and the newspaper, but I hope that in the great arc, karmic arc of life, that the time that I spent there had something to do with the fact that I'm actually worth listening to and get invited back here in the same space where the newspaper and radio station were in order to talk to you. And it's a fascinating topic because I doubt New York University held a 6-month program in the late 19th century called Greece at 60. I was here in 1978, and I'm pretty sure there was no program called Yugoslavia at 60. The birth of the State of Israel is one of those epoch-making events in history, something that has an effect on the rest of the world, disproportionate to the size of the land, disproportionate to the size of the people, and the consequences of which we've been living with in one way or another ever since. So, Professor Zweig, maybe we could start with what makes Israel different. Why would a sliver of land hugging the eastern Mediterranean be something that the world has had so much a joy and be fits about for the 6 decades since?
I think one of the reasons there's so much interest in Israel reaching 60 is that unlike the other countries, well, I shouldn't say that regarding Yugoslavia, but unlike most countries, it's not just a question of celebrating Israel's birth. It's watching Israel's continued survival in the challenges that it faces. So in a sense, Israel is something like a spectator sport.
So we won't be having Burkina Faso at 60 and because it's just not threatened, because it's just not something that we think about and worry about very much?
I could perhaps express it a little bit less flippantly and say that Israel's continued struggle to survive and prosper in a hostile environment is an endlessly fascinating spectacle.
Well, let's talk about the circumstances of its difficult birth. To many in 1948, there was a fond desire that there should be no Israel at 10, 20, or anything stretching out on into the future, that there should be no Israel at all.
Indeed, and the ability of a minority community, an ethnic community of 650,000 people, to survive the opposition of a local Palestinian Arab population twice its size, and then survive the concerted invasion of the country of the surrounding Arab states is itself a remarkable historical event, historical achievement.
But what about that time and the circumstances of the birth of the state created the narrative that followed in the years after? Had it happened in a different way, could it be argued, would there have been no attempted invasion again a few years later, again in '67, again in the early '70s, and so on?
I presume you're alluding to the fate of the Palestinian Arab population in Palestine, later on in Israel, the flight of the refugees, expulsion of the refugees. A very complicated process as it played out over the many months of fighting, as there was a complicated and very bloody civil war in the British mandated territory of Palestine, in which not only the Palestinian refugees but also a significant part of the Jewish population became refugees internally, had to leave their homes and villages because of the internal fighting. But one side emerged victorious and adopted a policy whereby their enemies, the Palestinian Arabs, were not allowed to return to their previous homes. That, and I think that fact more than anything else, has dictated the continuing conflict.
Jeffrey Goldberg, if you look back over the past couple of millennia, there are countless people who have fought over individual pieces of land, access to different bodies of water and territory, fought over competing visions of a certain place on the globe. And one side wins, the other loses, and that's often that. What's different about it happening in the 20th century that makes Israel's story different?
I mean, Israel's story is different on so many different levels. It takes time to unpack that. I mean, to just go back for 1 second to an earlier point. I mean, if Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem had been located in Burkina Faso, we'd be talking about Burkina Faso. If Jesus had been born in Burkina Faso, we'd be talking about Burkina Faso. So you have this kind of sui generis play. It's a sliver of land, but incredible events have taken place or are believed to have taken place there. So you start at that baseline. It's just as pure story. It's compelling in a way that very few other stories are. But to go to the point about winning and losing, I mean, you could look at it in a number of ways. Neither side actually won, and you know, here I'll present you both sides of the narrative, both narratives, if you will. The Israeli narrative or the Zionist narrative is, why is it going on today? It's because the Arabs chose cynically not to resettle their fellow Arab brothers from Palestine into their own lands. At the time of Israel's birth, there were 6 Arab states. Now there are 22 or so. Depends on how you count. But most of the time, when people lose a war, which is what happened, the refugees eventually melt away into whatever population they have to be living in. And the Israelis argue, of course, that there's a mirror imaging going on, because 800 or 900,000 Jews were expelled or departed from Arab countries at that same period. They are not now living in refugee camps along the outside borders of Israel. They've been absorbed more or less fully into Israel. So that's the Israeli narrative. The Palestinian narrative, of course, is that an injustice so cosmic was committed against us that that we can't help but fight for what is ours. And furthermore, we're Palestinian. You know, it's an act of hubris or callousness on the part of Israelis, Palestinians would say, to say, well, just go live in Egypt, or go live in Syria, or go live in Saudi Arabia. Well, they don't want to live in Saudi Arabia because they're Palestinian, and it's not so easily dismissed. But I mean, part of the so what you're dealing with is the 48 war. What we're living in now is the 48 war. I mean, it hasn't ended. It's just never ended.
Could it have been otherwise?
Of course it could have been otherwise.
Well, what are some of the ways it could have been otherwise?
Well, all right. I mean, you can talk about, we were just talking about a fellow, a mutual friend, Benny Morris, who's done a lot of interesting history about this period. And Benny got into trouble some years ago when he said that, well, you know, this problem would be a cleaner problem if the Israelis had gone all the way and actually expelled all of the Arabs, just removed all of the Arabs from what became Israel. And it is interesting, and I'm not putting a value judgment or moral judgment on this, but Israel is Israel. If you look at Israel in sort of as a colonizer, it wasn't a very good colonizer. If you look at settler states throughout history, settler states that have succeeded to this day succeeded because they either annihilated their local populations, like the United States or Australia, or they subjugated them and marginalized them to the point where they lost the will to fight. Much of South America would fall into that. Israel did not annihilate them, nor did it subjugate them, nor did it do what Jabotinsky said the Zionists should do, which would teach the Arabs that there's no point. They use the iron wall approach, that there's no point in fighting because you will never get what you want. So from that perspective, you could say that Israel did a pretty bad job of establishing itself. From my perspective, of course, the alternatives here would have been extremely inhumane. You can't just go around annihilating people. I mean, Israel is born because of that problem, because of a problem of genocide. Another response would have been for the Arab world, the Muslim world, to say, you know what? This land is Muslim and it's Palestinian, but we can't deny the Jewish connection to this land. I mean, and since we can't deny it, it's irrefutable, there's been a continuous Jewish presence here for 2,000 years, let us open our hearts and say, okay, so some Jews can come live here. Remember that Zionism, much of the Zionist movement, did not want statehood necessarily until pretty late in the game. There was a hope for a Jewish autonomous area in Palestine, and even into the late 40s, you know, the Judah Magnus types of what you would call left-wing Zionist thinkers were never really arguing for a Jewish state. They just wanted a Jewish homeland, a place for Jewish refugees to go. And if the Palestinian Arab community had not been led by people like Haj Amin al-Husseini, had been led by more moderate types, maybe you wouldn't have had the problems that you have today. I'm not even going to, I mean, he can talk about some of the Israeli mistakes, Palestinian mistakes, but that's just a primer.
I would like to add something. There is another way. The third way could have been different. Israel did not prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, as the United Nations partition resolution originally called for. Had, in 1948, the Arab world decided to create a Palestinian state next to Israel, we would have had a two-state solution 60 years ago, and the current Palestinian problem wouldn't have existed. Israel didn't block the creation of a Palestinian state in 1948.
Right, you have two, I mean, it's very interesting. You could have had a one-state solution 60 or 80 years ago. That was a possibility, and he's absolutely right. The Israelis had no designs at the time on even East Jerusalem, much less the West Bank or the Gaza Strip.
A two-state solution.
Two-state solution,
yes.
Yeah. We'll talk about the three-state solution
later.
later.
Was that over the long haul a state that was geographically enforceable as a state? If many people look back at that old partition map, the pre-war planned map, and say, well, look at this. This wasn't going to work.
Had the Palestinians accepted the partition as the United Nations proposed it in November 1947, they would have had more territory at their disposal for the creation of a Palestinian state than is being discussed now for the Palestinian state. So their state would have been even more viable. I'm not sure that Israel would have been as viable as it very definitely is now, but the Palestinian state certainly would have been. And I believe the conflict would have evolved in an entirely different way.
Now, you heard Jeffrey talk about one of the choices being physical elimination of the other from the land, a sort of Koch party solution. Was that incompatible with a state that also presumed not to live by muscle alone, but to have an ethical basis, to call itself the Jewish state, that meant that there was a shorter list of possible choices in the world of statecraft compared to what other countries do?
What you're referring to is the concept of transfer, as it has changed and developed historically. As it was raised, first of all, by the British in the Peel Commission of 1937 recommendations, transfer was a way of addressing the problem of a landless Palestinian agricultural population who were disadvantaged in Palestine and could perhaps be resettled elsewhere with sufficient funding, which was incidentally supposed to be Jewish funding. It was never conceived of in the pre-state period as the result of the use of arms, of a violent upheaval, the forced expulsion. It was considered in a much more moderate population exchange development within the empire sort of possibility. The idea has become a dangerous buzzword since then to suggest that the Zionists were always conceiving some dastardly, forceful expulsion of the Arabs. But that's not true. There have always been small fringe parts of the Zionist movement who would have maybe fantasized about that, but the mainstream majority were quite consistent with the use of the term at the time, the voluntary transfer of a landless population to parts of the Arab world which were unsettled.
But if you're going to call yourself the Jewish state, do you have a shorter list of means at your disposal in order to create facts on the ground? Are there fewer tools to you than are available to other states that just say, look, our enemies hate us, they want to kill us, let's neutralize them?
Like to think so.
Yes, so would I.
I mean, you know, that's the burden of being Jewish, which is no burden really. It's a joy. I mean, you know, it's Sharansky, who I have problems with for obvious reasons right now. Once said that, you know, Russians are good at being imperialists. You know, they just come in, kill everybody, take their land, and that's it.
They won.
Jews are bad at it. Jews aren't good at it. And when '67 came around and Israel found itself in the West Bank and Gaza, all sorts of theories were devised about enlightened occupation. And we're going to be different. This is going to work out differently. Everything is going to be okay because we're Jewish. Of course, occupation is occupation. Eventually, its corrupting effects seep into you, even enlightened Jews. But you're right. I mean, this is the dilemma, and this is one of the things that makes the story interesting. This is the dilemma that Jews hold themselves to a different standard, or should, I believe. The world certainly holds Israel to a different standard. There's a kind of weird double victimization going on. There's this idea that because you were victims of persecution, you should be you should not persecute, which is sort of, actually the lesson should be Germans shouldn't persecute, not Jews, but we'll put that aside. The world does hold Israel to a standard of behavior that it doesn't hold other countries. If you look at the way the UN votes, for instance, 30% of UN resolutions condemning a country for human rights violations are directed at Israel. You know, far more than Sudan, Burma, and China combined. But that being said, it's always been my hope, and it